Penn State could win a national title this year. I'm back to get your hopes up. It's the 2023 Penn State football preview show for normal people who haven't been paying attention to everything Penn State football since last season ended. Friends, family, other people, if you're a Penn State football fan, you have got to be excited about this year's team. Coming off a Rose Bowl victory in Pasadena against Pac-12 champion Utah, this team is poised to do big things in 2023. They've got 8 starters coming back on the offensive side of the ball, 8 starters coming back on the defensive side of the ball. They've got depth at every single position. And maybe the most exciting of all, they've got superstars all over the field on the defensive side of the ball. Every level, you've got superstars. You've got Abdul Carter, Chop Robinson, Kalen King. That's just to name a few. And on the offensive side of the ball, Olu Fashanu, Drew Aller, we hope, can be a superstar. And then, of course, Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen. So many things to be excited about with this team, and also a schedule that I think lines up in their favor. Some tests early on for this team to kind of get sharpened up for those later matchups against Ohio State and Michigan. Speaking of which, all the fans last year, yes, were happy with the Rose Bowl, but you didn't beat Ohio State and you didn't beat Michigan. Can Penn State do it this year? I think they can for all those aforementioned reasons, and I think this team can turn dreams into reality and win a national title for the first time since the 1986-87 season when I was just 2 years old. So I don't count that. I don't count that. That's not even in my lifetime. I want to see a national championship now. This is the team that I think has the best opportunity to do it in a very long time at Penn State. We're going to talk about the offense. We're going to talk about the defense. But first, let me catch you up to speed on what happened since that Rose Bowl victory against Utah. I think the biggest news of the offseason was there wasn't much news, which is really good if you're a Penn State fan. It means there's stability within the program. The coaching staff, for the most part, stayed pretty much intact. And there weren't really many exits from the team in terms of portal entries and things like that that weren't expected. So everything pretty much went to plan in the offseason for Penn State. No major injuries to contributing players. And so you come into this season with not much drama. There were some coaching changes. One on the offensive side of the ball. James Franklin, following that Rose Bowl victory against Utah, fires wide receivers coach Taylor Stubblefield, hires Marcus Hagans from Virginia to take his place. Now, it's not like Taylor Stubblefield was an awful coach or an awful recruiter, but we've seen lately, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, James Franklin is running a cutthroat business in Penn State in terms of his coaching staff. He has no patience for anybody that is not at the highest level. That's where he's trying to be. So everybody on the staff has to be on that level. Taylor Stubblefield wasn't meeting his expectations. He's out. Hagans is in. Who is Marcus Hagans? Well, he's a legend at Virginia. Played his football career there at quarterback, 2002 to 2005. Had a cup of coffee in the NFL. Then back to Virginia, where he spent 11 seasons as the wide receivers coach and coached, I believe it's something like 10 out of the 15 receiving leaders for the Virginia Cavaliers. So has a history of developing players, is known to be a very personable guy, a guy who is all about relationships and has good relationships with his players. Penn State always preaches family, so it seems like that's a good fit. And speaking of family, Anthony Poindexter, the safeties coach, who's also a legend at Virginia, played his ball there and was a safety, an absolute crazy stud. Go watch his film as a player. He's good friends with Marcus Hagans, to the point where Marcus Hagans named his son after Anthony Poindexter. So a family connection there. I'm sure Anthony Poindexter had something to do with that hire. I would be shocked if he didn't. Hagans comes into the staff. We saw a drop-off from wide receiver a little bit last year, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how he coaches those guys up. There's a lot of talent in that room, but no one sort of started to take that next step to be dominant. I think they have the talent to do it this year. That is one of the maybe question marks on this team, the wide receiver room. Something I'm going to be looking at early in the season to see, what's going on there, who's developing. And Marcus Higgins has a big say in that. On the defensive side of the ball, John Scott, the defensive line coach, leaves for the Detroit Lions, where he'll be their defensive line coach, coaching Aiden Hutchinson. Not a bad gig, and leaving behind all the recruiting and craziness of college football. So Scott's out, and who's in? Well, John Scott did a pretty good job of recruiting. He was kind of a quieter guy, but still got the job done. His biggest recruiting win, I would argue, is getting denied Dennis Sutton. Dennis Sutton was sought after by everybody, and his top three was Georgia, Alabama, and Penn State. He chooses Penn State, comes to the Nittany Lions, and that was a big win for John Scott. But I would argue that recruitment probably also had a lot to do with somebody behind the scenes, somebody by the name of Dion Barnes, who was a graduate assistant for Penn State for 3 seasons, 2020 through 2022. And you might remember his name as a player at Penn State. He was recruited by Paterno. He played under Bill O'Brien, and he played under James Franklin. So that crazy, tumultuous time in Penn State history, Dion Barnes was there for it all. So seemed like a slam dunk hire, but it took a long time for James Franklin to decide on this. Usually when a guy leaves the program from the coaching staff, another guy comes and fills his spot. James Franklin has these guys in mind and usually fills the position pretty fast. This took a couple weeks if I'm not mistaken. And so you're wondering what's going on behind the scenes. Later it comes out Franklin did his due diligence and interviewed NFL coaches, college coaches, and time after time, Dion Barnes' name rose to the top. And no matter who they put against him, he was the man for the job. So they really feel like he's a rising talent in the sport. Just so happens that he's a letterman, but really looking forward to not skipping a beat on the offensive line, because all these guys already have a relationship with him all the way back to their high school days when he was having a big part in recruiting them, and he's now on the staff. It's a trend that we've seen recently, I think, from James Franklin, of bringing more lettermen back into the program. Right now, there are 3 lettermen on the staff. Dion Barnes on the defensive side of the ball. Ty Howell, the tight ends coach, on the offensive side of the ball, also a player during that tumultuous time. He was a part of that 2012 squad. I don't believe he played under James Franklin, but he did play under Paterno and O'Brien. And then on the defensive side of the ball, again, you got the old head, Terry Smith, who at this point is almost just like another head coach. That's kind of how he's thought of. He's an excellent recruiter. He's one of the best recruiters in the nation. And that's actually, he's on top 10 lists on recruiting sites. And so you got 3 guys on the staff who are lettermen. And then behind the scenes, you bring in these analysts. That's kind of like a new thing. If you're not familiar, more and more analysts are being hired for college programs. Offensive analysts, defensive analysts, to break down film, do all the things that the position coaches can't actually do or don't have time to do. And so in that sense, you've got Dan Connor as a defensive analyst. You might remember him. He played a little bit of football at Penn State, an absolute legend. Then you've got Alan Zamias, who just came into the fold last year as a recruiting coordinator. You've got Torrance Brown now as a graduate assistant. He was a defensive end at Penn State. He's now going to be a graduate assistant under Dion Barnes. So a lot of youth at that defensive end coaching position. And then you've got LeVar Arrington being very active, Michael Maudy being very active in the NIL realm. So all the things NIL Penn State's trying to do, LeVar Arrington and Michael Maudy have been very vocal about being involved with that. And then Adam Brenneman and Christian Hackenberg also getting involved in NIL efforts. So just in general, a lot of lettermen around the program right now. It's kind of cool to see as a fan, because these guys you remember playing, and now they're all part of the staff, or at least somewhat involved in the program, which I think just speaks to the culture James Franklin has created. And it's something that I think is really cool to have all these guys come back. Speaking of the head man, James Franklin, this will be year number 10 for James Franklin. Yes, you're getting old, as am I. 10 years ago he started. Here he is in his 10th season. He's got a Rose Bowl victory, a Fiesta Bowl victory, a Cotton Bowl victory, a Big Ten championship. but he's missing that big ring. He's missing that national championship, and they haven't seen a college football playoff appearance. But he's got 4 11-win seasons. Now, just to put that into perspective, I think sometimes us Penn State fans can be a little critical of James Franklin, but we're not basing that criticism on reality. Previous to James Franklin getting here, the previous 20 years, there were only 5 seasons with 11 or more wins. James Franklin's first 9 seasons, he has 4, just to put it in a little bit of perspective. And speaking of perspective, another criticism of James Franklin, he can't win the big game, namely, he can't beat Ohio State or Michigan. Let's start with Michigan. That's another one where I think fans have a little bit of a skewed idea of, what Penn State did before James Franklin got there compared to how they fared before. Prior to Franklin's arrival, Penn State was 7-10 against Michigan since joining the Big Ten, and that included, I don't know if you remember this, but that included a stretch between 1997 and 2007 where Penn State lost to Michigan 9 times in a row. This is not a James Franklin problem. Penn State has had difficulty beating Michigan for a very long time. James Franklin's first, several years in the program, they sort of pulled to within 500. And then Michigan has since pulled away as their top dogs in the Big Ten right now. But I just think that's a bit of a skewed criticism. James Franklin is doing pretty much exactly what Penn State did previous to his arrival, and he's actually improving on it a little bit. Now with Ohio State, look, there's no sugarcoating this. He's 1-7 against Ohio State. That's abysmal. But again, let's look at since before he got there, Penn State was 7-16 against Ohio State since joining the Big Ten. So it's not that far off. I mean, and recently, 1-7, I guess, is a little far off. You can't sugarcoat it. Ohio State has just been absolutely dominant of Penn State. Penn State's kept it competitive, but fans don't want competitive. They want something in the win column. James Franklin's only been able to do that once. So that trend needs to change for Penn State to really take the next step. But I would also argue that Ohio State, in the years since James Franklin started coaching at Penn State, has just become an absolute juggernaut a la Alabama. So there's a lot of criticism with James Franklin, but the man has done a great job, and I think we're very lucky to have him. I'm off my soapbox now. Let's get into the offensive side of the ball and talk about their season. Before we get into the offensive preview, I got to give credit where credit is due. I spent all offseason, every day, reading Lions 24/7, Blue White Illustrated, listening to both of their podcasts, listening to the State of State podcast, listening to Steve Jones' radio show, reading for the Bloggy and watching their YouTube clips. So much stuff. I'm probably missing other sources of information. So all of that is kind of floating in my head, and I want to give credit where credit is due because those guys do a lot of research and do a lot of work, a lot of good work that keeps me fed pretty much with my obsession. And so now I've basically curated all that information and I'm giving it to you. So thank you to all those people who are involved in those websites and those productions. I love it, and I follow it all year long. So credit where credit's due. Let's get into the offense, and I'm going to rattle off some stats. And actually, I read this on a For the Bloggy post just to kind of illustrate how far Penn State's offense came from 2021, where it was absolutely abysmal. I mean, do you even remember? We could not run the ball in 2021. It was maddening to watch. And then 2022, it was like an entirely new team. And there's stats to back it up. So if you were watching it and you thought, wow, this team's better, you were right. They were. 87th in yards per game in 2021 with 365. And in 2022, they were 31st in yards per game with 434. So, I mean, you're talking about, what? I can't do the math. 70 yards more per game. It's a pretty substantial increase, good enough for 31st in the country. And you would think that that number would continue to improve this year, considering how many returning contributors on that side of the ball. 35.8 points per game last season. That was 15th in FBS. and tied for second in red zone efficiency with teams like Georgia and Ohio State, 5.8 points per red zone trip. They were 114th in red zone efficiency in 2021. So yeah, an improvement there by about 112 spots or whatever it is. 181 rushing yards per game last season. They had 111 yards rushing per game in 21. So every single category was a major upgrade last year in terms of statistics. And I really believe that it all started up front with a vastly improved offensive line. Let's talk about those guys. You can't start talking about the 2023 Penn State offensive line without first talking about Olu Fashanu, the big-time left tackle for Penn State. Now, I know I said nothing really crazy happened in the offseason, but I would argue the craziest thing that happened was Olu Fashanu, who was eligible for the NFL draft last year, decided to come back. That's after a lot of pundits had him going in the top 10 possibly, maybe the number one tackle off the board. Leaves all that money on the table, comes back to Penn State to finish his education, and get some unfinished business done on the field. Those are his words. So a huge move for Penn State. It's almost like they just got a blockbuster trade, if you're talking about Major League Baseball or something like that, because left tackle is arguably one of the most important positions on the entire field. He's going to be protecting presumably Drew Aller's blind side. And so a very important position, and a position you want to have one of your best players on the field. And I really think he could be one of the highest drafted players Penn State has had maybe since Saquon Barkley. Top 5, top 10 type draft pick potential. And the reason why he's so good is because he's a large human being. First of all, obviously he's on the offensive line at a D1 school, 6'6", 320 pounds. But the thing that sets him apart, and the thing that really sets all big-time left tackles apart, is the quickness on the feet. Now, you can't even see this really in game-time action when you're just watching the game. It's hard to really pay attention and see exactly what he's doing. And in fact, most of the time with the offensive line, you're only ever really complaining about them. You're not saying, oh, the offensive line did a great job. Maybe sometimes, but usually they're just getting criticized. And so it's hard to really see the intricacies of the game. But there's enough video evidence out there now. You can go on YouTube and watch him play and really focus on what he's doing. And he's just an incredible athlete for his size. That's why he's so well regarded by scouts in the NFL. So, I mean, just a remarkable talent. And what a job by Phil Trautwein, the offensive line coach. I mean, going back to what I said about James Franklin, getting rid of guys on the staff who aren't at an elite level and replacing them with guys who are. Penn State went through Herb Hand as the offensive line coach. Then they had Matt Linegrover as the offensive line coach. Penn State was not known for their offensive lines during the tenure of those two coaches. They bring in young up-and-comer Phil Trautwein a few years ago from Boston College. He actually played on the Florida Gators national championship team, which is coming back into the news because of a Netflix documentary. So a big-time college player, played in the NFL, and now an elite recruiter and developer of O-line talent. Olu Fashanu was a 3-star prospect. Now, I think people who maybe within the program felt a little more highly of him than 3 stars, but Phil Trautwein has now taken a 3-star offensive lineman prospect and turned him into a bona fide top 5, top 10 type NFL pick. So great developer of talent, and you got to give credit where credit's due. Yes, of course, to Olu Fashanu, but also to Phil Trautwein. I do also want to mention that Olu is the smartest player on the team, apparently, with a 4.0 grade point average. So just an absolute freak, Olu Fashanu, big number 74. If you have him, if you're at a game or if you're watching a game on TV, stop watching the ball for a second and just watch number 74 do his thing. It's a thing of beauty. It's a giant ballet dancer out there. Olu is the man. Let's go to the other tackle spot, right tackle, which has kind of been interesting in the last couple seasons. Caden Wallace has gotten a ton of snaps at right tackle. He's really been your starter there for the past 2 seasons, but fans have kind of been disappointed by that right tackle position. Bryce Effner took a lot of snaps from Caden Wallace last season because Caden is just never really, he's flashed great potential, but he's never consistently played an extremely high level like on the other side with Olu. So there's some question marks there at the right tackle position. Drew Shelton is another right tackle who was a freshman last season and came in and replaced Olu Fashanu on the left side last year and did remarkably well for a freshman. You don't really see freshmen come in and perform well on the offensive line. Drew Shelton did that. And so in the offseason this year, you said, okay, well, maybe let's move Drew Shelton over there to the right tackle spot, get Caden Wallace out of the way, and now we've got two great tackles bookending. Well, that doesn't sound like it happened because Caden Wallace, by all accounts, has stepped up his game in a big way. I think by all accounts, in terms of what's coming out of the coaching staff, he had one of the best off seasons of anyone in the entire program and has now positioned himself as a surefire starter there at right tackle. Really going to be watching that in these first few games. Is the right tackle a position of strength for this offensive line? I really hope Caden Wallace put it together, and it is, but we will soon find out. But speaking of depth across the board, you got Drew Shelton, who can come in at any time at either tackle position, and really you're not going to skip too much of a beat as you saw last year. He's definitely got more developing to do, but Drew Shelton is the guy also to keep your eye on. Big number 66. Caden Wallace, by the way, 6'5", 341. Giant human being. Drew Shelton, 6'5", 308. So just talking about some sizes there because this O-line is not lacking for size. Let's move into the interior. Penn State's going to have to replace Juice Scruggs, the center, who is now, I believe, going to be the starter for the Houston Texans. So you got an NFL starter at center who was your center last season. That's some big shoes to fill if you're a Penn State lineman. But Penn State seems like they have a guy to do it. Last year, they went out in the portal and they got one of the most highly sought-after offensive linemen in the portal in Hunter Norzad, who chose between Michigan and Penn State, chooses Penn State, spent a lot of time developing last year and getting used to this level of college football, but also played a ton of snaps at the guard position, specifically left guard, I believe. He played a ton of snaps there. He now slides in and takes over at center. So, what do you need in a center? Well, of course, you need elite athletic ability, as all these guys have at this level, but you need brains. And this guy's coming from an Ivy League. He's got a degree from Cornell, comes in, he's now your center. Why do they need a big brain? I mean, you're having to process information when you get up to the line about whose responsibility in terms of pointing out to this guard here, you've got that guy, I'm taking the linebacker out there, depending on the play. There's a lot of information processing, almost like a quarterback. I would argue that the center is like a quarterback of that offensive line. Hunter Norzad is going to be your quarterback there, snapping the football. So big Hunter Norzad, 6'3", 315. You get a little bit squatter when you get to the interior line. 6'3", still a huge person, but a little shorter. Talking about the guard positions, probably, prior to a few weeks ago, I would have been excited to tell you about Landon Tengwall. I believe it's his third year in the program. He was the number one recruit in his class when he came in, I believe, in the 21 class. High hopes for him. He's played a lot of football for Penn State before he got injured last year. But camp rolls around and media availability happens and they're not seeing him. And then they don't see him at picture day. And they don't see him any other time there's media availability. And James Franklin keeps his lips sealed about injuries, so we don't really know if it is an injury. It seems like that would be the case, but no one's seen or heard from Landon Tengwall, the left guard. So I'll be very interested to see how that all plays out. The good news is James Franklin will tell you if there's been a season-ending injury, so I don't think it's that serious. But certainly I don't expect to see him play in the West Virginia game. Let's talk about depth again, because J.B. Nelson played a ton of snaps last year when Landon Tengwall went down. And he's a guy who could play on the outside at left tackle, but you really want to see him play at guard. And I'll tell you, this guy came from Lackawanna College. Does that ring a bell? Jaquan Brisker, Tig Brown. Now they're going to be lighting it up in the NFL. Jaquan Brisker is already looking like he's going to be an all-pro. Tig Brown, high hopes for him. He's now on the San Francisco 49ers. Both guys from Lackawanna College. J.B. Nelson looks to continue that lineage of really strong players to come out of there, continue that pipeline for Penn State. And again, it's the depth of this team. You lose a guy like Tangwall, you think everything's going to crumble on the interior. But J.B. Nelson proved last year that he's a bona fide guy, and the coaching staff has had nothing but good things to say about his development in this offseason. So excited to see how he does there on the interior. And then on the other side, you kind of got a stalwart over there in Sal Wormley, the right guard. You don't hear much from him, and that's usually a good thing when you're talking about offensive linemen. I believe he started every single game last year. He was named Big Ten honorable mention, all Big Ten honorable mention. He was the offensive player of the game twice, named by the Penn State coaching staff last season. So it's not a name maybe that you would hear about a lot, but it's a name that has been a consistent performer for this offensive line. So across the board, there aren't many weaknesses on this offensive line, which is welcome news. They look to pick up where they left off in that last season. Mentioned the extreme increase in yards per game in terms of rushing, 111 in 21, 181 in 22. I think they could get maybe over 200 yards per game rushing on average. I mean, we'll see how this offense performs. Maybe they want to throw the ball more, but they have the ability to run the ball at will if they want to, and they've got a crazy elite pass protector in left tackle Olu Fashanu. So the offensive line is definitely a bright spot on this team. I would argue it's the deepest, most talented offensive line in the James Franklin tenure, and you might have to go back at least 10 years, maybe more, before you've seen an offensive line at this level. They're going to be blocking for those amazing running backs. Let's talk about them now. Penn State has been absolutely loaded at the running back position for a very long time. We as fans are pretty spoiled when it comes to watching elite running backs at Penn State. Obviously, Saquon Barkley is what comes to mind for everybody, but it goes way further back than that. And now you've got two all-timers, in my opinion, already in Kaytron Allen and Nicholas Singleton. These guys remind me of kind of that old school, let me rewind my brain really quick, Aaron Harris and Curtis Enis. Remember those guys? You got Curtis Enis, he was the home run hitter, and you had Aaron Harris, who was going to punish you if you tried to tackle him. So he was kind of your short yardage guy. If you needed a yard, you got it. Curtis Enis would make the highlight reel and maybe a top 10 play on SportsCenter. So that's kind of what I think about with Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton in the context of Penn State running backs. But let's start with Nick Singleton, and let's stay on that theme of historical context. Think back to the 95 Rose Bowl, Kajana Carter, the 2017 Rose Bowl in Saquon Barkley, and then the 2023 Rose Bowl with Nicholas Singleton.
And breaks it. He's gone. Goodbye. It'll be touchdown, Penn State, first play of the ball game.
Still going. Saquon Barkley all the way to the end zone. Nick Singleton in a foot race. One that he will win. Touchdown, Penn State.
It gives you chills. It gives you chills to watch those highlights, to watch those guys run across that rose in the middle of the field. Three incredible backs in Penn State history, and we're lucky to be watching one of them right now in Nicholas Singleton. Big Ten Freshman of the Year last year. He broke a freshman record at Penn State with 12 touchdowns, and he joins a very exclusive list of Penn State freshman running backs, Saquon Barkley and DJ Dozier, for the only freshman running backs, to run for 1,000 yards or more. Hard worker, a guy who's crazy in the weight room, can squat, maybe not as much as Saquon, but maybe he'll get there. Hard worker in the weight room, an extremely humble guy. If you ever hear him, in an interview or any type of setting like that, and just a guy you want to represent the program. So not only is he an incredible athlete, but also just seems like a good guy. And speaking of which, I mean, you gotta love Kaytron's smile. I mean, both of these guys are so likable. That's the thing. They're not hotshot guys when really they have every reason to be because of their stats backing it up. But Kaytron Allen, just a guy who's taken his position on this team. He's like, hey, I'm not the guy, and neither really is Nicholas Singleton because he's sharing snaps with Kaytron. But Kaytron, when you call upon him and say, hey, buddy, we need 1 yard, he'll get it for you. And that cannot be taken for granted, especially if you're a Penn State fan. And there were a couple seasons, even in recent memory, where we couldn't get 1 yard. And the thing about Kaytron Allen is he's always falling forward, always getting that 1 yard when you need it. So you got Fat Man Kaytron Allen. That's his nickname from back in the day. I guess he was fat at some point, but looks pretty good to me. And then you got Gatorade and Nicholas Singleton. Gatorade's his nickname because he was Gatorade Player of the Year. You could also call him Thunder and Lightning. Kaytron's going to bring that boom to the line of scrimmage, and lightning is going to strike when Nick Singleton touches the ball. That's the thing. You talk about big play, big explosive play, the ability to have those explosive plays in a game. It's so important to have a superstar like Nick Singleton on your offense if you're wanting to be at that elite level. When you have a guy who can touch the ball and go 80 yards, you're in good shape as an offense. He can bail you out at times. He can give you a jump start if you're, starting a little slow. There's just so many things that Nicholas Singleton brings to the table. And then, of course, Kaytron Allen fills in all those gaps that you need from him in terms of getting those short yardage situations. So 2 incredible running backs that we're really lucky to have. Enjoy it while it lasts. Now, look, Penn State's already doing incredibly well recruiting all the way into 2026 at this point. They've got great running backs lined up to play because it's just become a premier landing spot for high-level high school running backs. But right now, you're watching 2 all-timers, in my opinion. And so the question is, who's behind them? How do you back up these guys? And that was a question going into the offseason because last year the season ended with very little depth behind them. Tank Smith was the only running back really that you saw in the Rose Bowl, and I don't even believe he's on scholarship. Tyler Holsworth, another walk-on. So you had Singleton and Allen, and then a bunch of walk-ons backing them up. Well, now things have gotten a little bit more stable. They brought in 2 freshman running backs who by all accounts are exceeding expectations at the position in London Montgomery and Cam Wallace. And then you've got one of the more underrated moves by Penn State in the offseason to go to the portal and go get a running back in Trey Potts. Now, Trey Potts from Pennsylvania, Penn State recruited him a little bit out of high school, but again, they're recruiting at such a high level they can be super picky. Trey Potts stays in the Big Ten, goes to Minnesota, has a great playing career there, mostly as a second stringer, but a productive back there. Penn State gets him as a grad transfer, and it's pretty much exactly what you want in this room. A veteran presence who will spell these guys if he needs to, and just another leader in that room. So the running back position, it is so stacked right now at Penn State and will be for the foreseeable future. I talked about Troutwine on the offensive line. You can't say enough things about Jaywan Sider. Excellent recruiter. Incredible developer. And after these guys leave the program, Kaytron and Nick Singleton, you're going to talk about 2 more NFL backs that he's going to have put into the league. Just an incredible job there at the running back position by Jaywan Sider. And another example of this staff and the sort of elite level that it's gotten to, I think, since James Franklin, maybe 5th or 6th year, when he just turned a corner and said, you know what? We want to be elite. We want to be the best of the best. And they're competing at every level. That's the coaching staff. That's every position group. And the running back position group might be the best on the team, but it's going to be a tight competition, which, again, speaks to how much talent there is on this team. Let's move to the tight ends. I just talked about being spoiled as a fan watching these running backs at Penn State. You can almost say the same thing about the tight ends that we've seen come through here as of late. You got Mike Gesicki, obviously, Pat Freiermuth, obviously. Both of these guys having successful playing careers in the NFL. And then Brenton Strange, who was a tight end last year, is now going to be playing for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So 3 NFL tight ends in the program in the last several years. And Theo Johnson looks to continue that trend. You think back in the day, again, you think of these big tight ends who were almost like glorified offensive linemen who could just happen to catch the ball. And now things have changed. Theo Johnson is a large human being, 6'6", 264, but he is an absolute freak athlete. And that's the type of tight end that we've seen come through the program as of late. Let's talk about Theo Johnson because he's got big shoes to fill. Brenton Strange was very productive at the tight end position last season, but we saw Theo Johnson come on and catch fire late in the season. I think he missed the first 3 or 4 games due to an injury, and by mid-season, he had kind of caught fire, and you kind of heard his name called a lot last season. He's going to be the leader there in that tight end room. And not only in the tight end room, but he's also been named a team captain. And James Franklin has just gone on and on and on about how Theo Johnson has developed as a leader on this Penn State team. And I think Penn State's really going to look to him early in the season on the offensive side of the ball to keep things steady, to be a safety valve for Drew Aller to throw to. He's a proven commodity at tight end. You know what you're getting. He's got sure hands. He's got athletic ability to get yards after the catch. And so he's almost like a wide receiver, but just a big mismatch wide receiver, mismatch against a linebacker, mismatch against a corner. So someone that I think Drew Aller is going to look to a lot, especially early in the season as the wide receivers start to develop and get a little better at that position. So keep your eye out for Theo Johnson early in the season to have some big numbers. Behind him, we've seen him for the past couple seasons. Tyler Warren is just a fan favorite, in my opinion, on this Penn State football team, big number 44. He was actually a quarterback in high school, and he set all sorts of records, I believe, at his high school as a quarterback. So to imagine, a guy in high school being the quarterback and then moving to, big-time college football tight end, he's another safety valve. And we're going to see both of those guys, Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren, on the field at the same time a lot of the time. And you could actually see one more tight end on the field at the same time in Khalil Dinkins. So we talk about Theo Johnson, you talk about Tyler Warren, you know those names. Who's Khalil Dinkins? Well, he's out of Pittsburgh, I believe. And James Franklin, he doesn't really talk a ton about players specifically. They'll ask, media members will ask him, hey, what do you think about this position group? And he'll say, or what do you think about this player? And he'll group that player with other players. So, well, these players are also good at that position. He has gone out of his way on multiple occasions to talk about Khalil Dinkins, number 16, and his development. And he said specifically, I can't quote it exactly, but it was something along the lines of Khalil Dinkins is a player that every fan is going to be talking about by midseason this year. Those are big words from the head coach, but you have to believe it because he doesn't say that a lot. He doesn't really just spout that out about everybody on the team. You rarely hear him be that emphatic about a player. So Khalil Dinkins, the presumed third stringer at the tight end spot, getting high praise from James Franklin and really calling him out to be really a star on this team. There's 3 tight ends right there. I mean, any team in the Big Ten, maybe save for a couple, would take any of those as their number 1 tight end. And you're talking about a room that's one of the premier tight end rooms in the country. And even freshmen, we'll talk about Andrew Rappleyea, who is a freshman coming in, and you should see him play at least a little bit. I don't know if he'll burn his red shirt just because of how many guys are in front of him, but I think he took number 87. He's from New England. He has a connection with Pat Freiermuth, and everybody's expecting big things out of Andrew Rappleyea. That's someone else to keep an eye on and an ear out for when watching games. Number 87. That's not Pat Freiermuth coming back to college to get an extra year of eligibility. That's actually Andrew Rappleyea. And so if he can develop into the type of player that Freiermuth was when he was a freshman, you're talking about 4 guys at the tight end position who can operate at an extremely high level. It's just a trend that we keep talking about. Depth, 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 depth. I'm not talking about guys who can come in and mop up duty. You're talking about guys that if Theo Johnson were to go out for any reason, you can fill that with a guy who's going to still operate at an extremely high level. So the tight end room is extremely healthy, led by, like I said, letterman Ty Howell, I believe in his 3rd year at the position. So everybody's feeling good about that room within the program, and I think fans should feel pretty good about it too. And I think that the thing that James Franklin said is, as they're looking for wide receivers to kind of fill the 3 spots of wide receiver, they realize, they could just put Theo Johnson out wide and kind of act like a wide receiver, and they plan to do that. So the tight ends are so versatile now with their athletic ability. Again, they're not glorified offensive linemen. They're almost glorified wide receivers, kind of hybrid linemen who are just freak athletes. Theo Johnson next in a long line right now of Penn State tight ends who are that type of a player. So yes, they are kind of like wide receivers, but there's a whole room of wide receivers that we got to talk about. Let's do that now. I think if there's a question mark on this team, it's probably in the wide receiver room, because we haven't really seen any of these receivers be the guy. Last season was the Parker Washington show. Before that was Jahan Dotson. Before that was KJ Hamler. Before that was Chris Godwin. A pretty nice list of your number one wide receivers if you're Penn State. But this year, there's kind of some question marks there. Who's going to be it? Well, James Franklin is very clear in saying that guy is Keandre Lambert-Smith. And no coincidence, he wears number 1. So a leader in that room, a guy who you kind of saw come on late in the season last year when he was getting more looks from Sean Clifford and had that incredible, I believe it was something like an 80-yard touchdown catch in the Rose Bowl. So he has kind of flashed a little bit, and he kind of looks like he could be that number 1 guy. We just haven't seen it yet. So that's why it's a question mark. And I don't want to, confuse you and say that it's a question mark and that's a bad thing. I just think it's an unanswered question. I think there's a ton of talent in the wide receiver room, led by Keandre Lambert-Smith, and there's also a ton of speed. Penn State's been recruiting athletes all over the field, but of course they've been recruiting great athletes at the wide receiver position. When we talk about Keandre Lambert-Smith, I believe he runs something like a 4.3, 4.40. Harrison Wallace, who's likely going to be another starter at wide receiver, runs a 4.4 40. And then Omari Evans, who we saw a ton last year actually as a freshman, which was kind of a surprise because you thought maybe Caden Saunders would be the freshman that would come in and play a lot last year. No, it was Omari Evans, number 5, and he runs a 4.3 40. So a lot of your guys, sub 4.4 40 guys, so a ton of speed at the wide receiver position, but just not a lot of production in terms of overall career because these are younger guys. Lambert-Smith, yes, he's been in the program 4 years. He actually has 1,000 yards receiving, which he according to PSU Sports, he's 37th, I guess, or the 37th player to have 1,000 yards receiving in Penn State history, which is kind of an interesting number because it's kind of lower than you think, especially a guy like Keandre Lambert-Smith who seems like quietly got there to 1,000 yards receiving. This year, hopes to explode, and I think he will. Sean Clifford really, he never really got to his second and third progression a lot of the times. He would look at his first receiver, and then sometimes he'd be under pressure and have to ad-lib. It seems like Drew Aller is a guy who's going to look at his first, second, and third progression, but you got to think that Keandre Lambert-Smith is going to be getting a lot more looks than he ever did in his whole career. So you probably are going to see production spike big time with him. James Franklin in the offseason constantly talked about the third wide receiver position. So you got Keandre Lambert-Smith. He can either play in the slot or out wide. And then you've got Harrison Wallace, who's going to play out wide. And then you've got a list of guys. I named Caden Saunders, Omari Evans, a ton of guys who could play in that third starting spot. Dante Cephas is a name that you might not know. Penn State went out and got him from Kent State in the portal. And this is a guy who's from the Pittsburgh area and went to Kent State and did extremely well there, highly productive. And you're thinking, okay, well, he's from Kent State, though. They're playing, a Kent State type schedule. But he did play against Michigan State. He did play against Georgia, and he was pretty productive in those games. So now he comes to Penn State. He was highly sought after by a lot of schools. And so Penn State was hoping that maybe he would just come in and take a starting job. Doesn't seem like that's the case, but he's now in the mix for that third wide receiver position. But a name that I got to let you know about that everybody's been talking about in fall camp and that you kind of saw flashes of last year is Lil Cliff. Liam Clifford. Yes, that's right. We still got a Clifford on the team. Liam Clifford is showing all signs that he's going to be on the field a lot at wide receiver this year. And if you watched him play last year, he was probably Drew Aller's favorite target when he was in the game, when they kind of brought in the backups when games got out of hand. And he just showed signs of really good route running and really sure hands. And that, in my opinion, when you're breaking in a brand new quarterback, is so important to have that receiver that if you throw to him, he's going to catch the ball. So Liam Clifford, I look to see big things from him this year. I'm going to keep an eye on, who that third receiver actually is on the field. Again, Keandre Lambert-Smith and Harrison Wallace likely going to spend a lot of time out there. But who else is going to step up? Caden Saunders, number 7, highly sought-after recruit. He was a 4-star, sometimes borderline 5-star, depending on the recruiting service you looked at. I expected him to come in last year and contribute. He didn't, but it sounds like he's taken a big step, and usually you do from your freshman to sophomore season. So I would definitely look at Caden Saunders as a guy who can come in and play in the slot and almost give you that spark. I don't want to name KJ Hamler, but that type of speed and quickness, short area quickness, yards after catch type of player. Caden Saunders could be that. It just remains to be seen. It goes back to this question mark. There is a question mark there. There is depth because there's just a lot of great athletes there. I should also mention Malik McClain, who they went to Florida State and got, and he played considerable time at Florida State. They brought him in. And they've also got Malik Mega, who I believe is 6'6". So they got two big targets. Malik McClain and Malik Mega, both 6'5", 6'6", around that area. Big-time receivers. So there's just a ton of names I can spout off. But this is one of those areas that I can't really tell you much about because we haven't seen much. So it is probably the question mark on the team, but I think it'll get answered pretty quickly, and it doesn't seem like anybody's too worried about this position. And again, you've got the tight ends to rely on, Theo Johnson in particular, and then Keandre Lambert-Smith is a guy with a lot of experience and sure hands. So you got options. It just remains to be seen how deep that room actually goes. But someone's got to get them the ball. Let's talk about the quarterbacks. Okay, I know. I said let's talk about the quarterbacks, but really you just want to talk about the quarterback. Drew Aller, 5-star quarterback. I mean, you know all about him. All right, this is a guy who comes into Penn State with very high expectations from the fan base, very high expectations from the program and within the Lash building. But really, you'll hear him time and time again say, nobody has higher expectations for him than him. So this is a guy that is extremely focused on being great. If you follow him in the offseason, you just see him constantly working. He said he worked with the wide receivers in the summer 4 times a week, running routes. Coaches aren't they aren't allowed to be with those players, so they have to be player-led type practices. And Aller was a leader in that and getting the room together, wide receiver room together, tight ends, running backs, whoever, to run routes and sort of get on the same page. So this is a guy who's very determined to be great. But as Penn State fans, again, we've seen this before, right? We saw it with Anthony Morelli back in the day. He was a 5-star quarterback. I hate to bring these names up, but I have to because this is what everybody's thinking. Can Drew be the guy? Finally, can we have a 5-star quarterback who is a 5-star quarterback? Anthony Morelli, 5-star quarterback, came into Penn State. Look, he had a good career. We're not talking about losing records here, but national championship type quarterback. Anthony Morelli was not it. Then you had a recruiting class with Rob Bolden, who was a 5-star, and Paul Jones, who was a 5-star. This is back in 2010, 2011 era. And both of those guys got beat out by a walk-on in Matt McGloin. So a couple other 5-star quarterbacks didn't really pan out. Everybody knows Christian Hackenberg. Now, look, he had an incredible freshman season, and there's so many factors that go into Christian Hackenberg's career at Penn State. It almost seems like he was just caught in the middle of the melee, and his development was stunted at Penn State because of it. So you can't really blame him, but he was another 5-star quarterback that wasn't really a 5-star quarterback by the time he left the program. So I hate to bring up all those names, but it's just reality. And that's what it is. So Penn State fans are sort of shell-shocked and afraid and have all these memories of 5-star quarterbacks not panning out. And here we are, Drew Aller, 5-star quarterback. I mean, this guy looks like, if you were to go to a factory and say, let's go to Boston Dynamics or whatever it is and build this robot that's a prototypical quarterback that has an insane arm, is huge, is a good leader. Let's just build one. That's Drew Aller. That's who you're dealing with. That's why there's so much hype around this guy. And we're going to see if it pans out. He's no doubt has a great arm. And I think the thing that James Franklin keeps going back to with Drew Aller is his appearance in the Purdue game. First game of the season last year as a true freshman. Sean Clifford goes back into the locker room after halftime, is nowhere to be found. I was actually sitting in the stands and watched him run back into the locker room after the whole team had come out. We're thinking, what's happening? He was running, so he wasn't injured or anything like that. I think it was a bathroom break, but no one's going to say that. They say it was cramps, whatever. It doesn't matter. It meant that Drew Aller got into the game. As a true freshman, first game ever in a Penn State uniform, on the road in Purdue, blackout, primetime game, Penn State in a tight one with Purdue. Drew Aller goes out there and shows fans everything they want to see in terms of what this guy has to offer. He showed most of all, and James Franklin says this time and time again, he showed poise. The stage was not too big for him. He made great throws. I remember specifically there was a throw he had to Tyler Warren that just kind of split in between two defenders. Tyler Warren dropped the ball. Come on, buddy. But it was an incredible throw, and Drew just showed really flashes of what he could potentially be as a Penn State quarterback. Throughout the season, he got a ton of playing time, more than, I was reading something recently where Bryce Young and some other quarterback, I can't remember exactly, some quarterbacks who didn't start their freshman year and then did their sophomore year, Drew outsnapped all of them in his freshman year. So he got really valuable playing time in his freshman year. Will that translate to a great sophomore season? I said it before, you usually make the jump from your freshman season to your sophomore season in terms of overall development. You even look at pictures of him as a freshman until now, and he's still got a baby face. You're not going to get away from that in 1 year, but he just looks a little older, a little bit more put together. Of course, 2 years in the training program. He just looks like a different person. So can he put it all together? From Medina, Ohio, a star there at that high school, 5-star talent, comes to Penn State. Can he buck the trend of having these big-time quarterbacks come to Penn State and not pan out? I hope so. And listen, if he does, if he plays well, I'm saying if he plays well, top 5 in the Big Ten, Penn State has a great shot at making the playoff. If he plays to his 5-star potential and plays how everyone thinks he can play, this is when we're talking about Penn State might be able to be in the conversation to be one of the best teams in college football this year. That's part of the equation. That is part of the equation. And it is a question mark because we haven't seen him be a starter yet. But if he can be that elite quarterback, Penn State could win a national title, like I said. So let's hope it happens. But it's going to take a really strong defense. We've got to talk about those guys now. When I think about this 2023 team, I'm constantly comparing them to teams from bygone eras at Penn State. We've seen so many good defenses come through Penn State over the years, and this year is going to be no different. It is going to be an amazing defense to watch out there if last year is any indication. Now, they do lose some pieces from last year. Obviously, Joey Porter Jr., borderline first-round talent. Tig Brown, a huge leader at the safety position and a huge leader on the defense and really the team. And then big PJ Mustipher, that big 320 or whatever pound defensive tackle, that's going to be missing this year. And also his leadership. So they lose leadership, they lose production on defense, but they bring back a lot of leadership and they bring back a lot of production and they bring back a ton of star power on the defensive side of the ball. Like I said, Penn State has a tradition of great defenses. We saw Brent Pry continue that tradition when James Franklin came over. And then when he had to hand it over to Manny Diaz, Manny came in and exceeded everybody's expectations probably last year. He is a superstar in terms of coaching the defensive side of the ball, and he's got a lot of pieces to work with this year. Let's talk about last year and what you saw on the field, because again, if you like the offense, you thought they were improved on the field. Stats back that up. Well, the defense, 4.6 yards per play. That was 3rd in college football. 18.2 points per game. That was 9th in college football last year. The big one for me is the secondary. 99 pass breakups. This is what everybody's talking about in preseason magazines and things like that because it's such a gaudy stat. 1st in college football last year in pass breakups. A nasty secondary that opposing quarterbacks are going to have to go up against, and namely Kalen King, who we'll get to in a second, but just a lot of talent at every level. and stats last year to back up the fact that wow, this team was good. They rush yards per game, 112. That was good for 16th last year. And I know that was a criticism because in the Michigan game, gave up a lot of rush yards to those two great backs from Michigan. And you hate to give them too much credit, but they did tear us up last year on the field. But I don't think necessarily that was too much of a defensive line problem, as it was also a linebacker problem and really just a team problem. And I really do feel like Penn State can get over that hump this year on defense. So let's start up front, just as we did on offense. Let's start up front on defense and talk about this defensive line. If you're talking about the Penn State defensive line, you start at defensive end. They have so much talent in that room. Again, it's just, I keep saying this, but it's not just me. It's national pundits that are agreeing with me on this. I'm not just pumping sunshine here. These guys are bona fide stars. Chop Robinson has all-American potential at the defensive end position. He showed it last year. 26 tackles, 19 solo, 10 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks, 2 pass breakups. I mean, this guy was all over the field. He was incredible. Comes over as a transfer from Maryland last year and just shows out. Just a great addition to the team. And it's scary to think about what he could develop in his third year playing big-time college football. Second year at Penn State, but third year in the Big Ten. High hopes for him at the defensive end position. And then on the other defensive end position, Adisa Isaac. Last year comes back from an Achilles injury. And, if you know even just a very little about injuries, Achilles injuries are very difficult to come back from. He had to take a full year or more off to recuperate from that injury. Comes back last year, and as the season went on, you start to see him kind of become what we knew he could be. And as the season goes on, he gets better and better. He's going to be back this year. He's going to be one of the best defensive ends in the Big Ten. And so you got 2 right there. But the guy that you're not even talking about is Denai Dennis Sutton. I spoke about him earlier about being a big recruiting win for Penn State. I mean, this is a guy who's going to see a ton of the field this year. He is an absolute monster at getting after the passer. If you watched the blue-white game or even saw highlights, I mean, it was almost unfair. He was destroying everybody in his path. It's funny because he was put on sort of the second-string team in the blue-white game. Can't remember which color that was, but he was dominating at the line of scrimmage against starting offensive linemen. Now, you could say, oh, well, that's bad for the offensive linemen, but really, I mean, Denai Dennis Sutton is that kind of a freak athlete. He is going to be all over the field this year. So there's 3 right there. And you could stop right there, and you already have 3 defensive ends that have all Big Ten type potential. But Amin Vanover is another guy who can come in. Depth is so important at the defensive end position because you can just continue to hammer away at an offensive line, specifically an offensive tackle. If you have a weak offensive tackle in the Big Ten, you do not want to face Penn State. You got so much talent at the defensive end spot that you're going to eventually break those guys down. Be patient, Penn State fans, because in the fourth quarter of games, you see it with Ohio State. You've seen it with Ohio State against us, where you keep it close, and in the fourth quarter it gets away. That's not a coincidence. That's because superior athletes who have superior athletes behind them for depth, they can stay fresh and continue to get after the quarterback at a high speed and a high level all game long. Penn State has that capability this year with at least 3 extremely high-level defensive ends, and then beyond that, Amin Vanover to be that 4th defensive end, and probably you can even go 2 more deep after that. So very talented at defensive end spot. Defensive tackle is a position that Penn State fans are constantly wondering about because I think really it's that memory of the Michigan game, and everybody thinks that it was the defensive tackles, and that was the problem. And even James Franklin came after that game and said, we need to get bigger at the defensive tackle position, and people went off and ran with that. So defensive tackle has been a hot-button issue for a fan in the offseason in terms of, are we going to be better there? What do we have there at the defensive tackle spot? Well, you have Hakeem Beamon, who's been with the program a long time. And the question with Hakeem Beamon has always been about his size. I think he was 260 last year playing defensive tackle, which is pretty small in the Big Ten to be playing defensive tackle. It's just a mass versus mass thing. If you have a 300-pound lineman and you're a 260 defensive tackle, you're going to get pushed around a little bit. And he even admittedly said that, so he put on good weight in the offseason. I believe he's up to almost 285, 290 pounds of good weight. And these are the types of things that happen in the offseason. The program sees a need, they develop a player in that way, and now Hakeem Beamon looks to be a bona fide starter on that defensive tackle spot. And then really, I think it's like 4 to 6 guys who could probably play defensive tackle at a starter type level. You've got Devon Ellies. You've got, like I said, Hakeem Beamon. You've got Keziah Izzard. You've got Jordan Vandenberg, he could be a professional power lifter, honestly. He is a very strong dude. If you look up videos of him on YouTube doing some lifting in Penn State's weight room, just an absolute beast. And actually, he made Bruce Feldman's Freaks list, which is an annual list that comes out of college football players who are absolute freaks. Vandenberg, who might be 4th or 5th on that defensive tackle depth chart, is right there. And then you got Zane Durant, who came in with a bang his freshman season last year. I mean, you think about that recruiting class last year and all the freshmen who contributed, Zane Durant being one of them. Again, a little undersized for defensive tackle, but I think he put on a little bit more weight this year, and I expect huge things from Zane Durant this year. If you're a quarterback and you get into 3rd and long type situations against this defense, I mean, it's going to be a murderer's row in terms of guys coming at you. At the defensive tackle spot, extremely athletic. Historically, you think about these giant defensive tackles that can't really move around. Penn State has just got athletes all across the defensive line that can get after the quarterback. So if they can play their game, which means stopping on 1st and 2nd down and creating 3rd and long type situations, that's the key to success for this defense. If you can get into a 3rd and long, they've got the pass rushers to get to the quarterback, even if you're only rushing 3 or 4. So a very strong defensive line this year. It's part of the bigger picture, which is a very strong defense. And at the next level, you got even more superstars. Let's talk about the linebackers. In doing this preview video, I didn't realize, it sounds hyperbolic because I keep saying, these guys are incredible and these guys are incredible. And wow, these guys line up with the best of the best in terms of Penn State history. But I mean, it is what it is. Abdul Carter is a part of a long lineage of freak linebackers to play the position at Penn State. And you got to start right there with number 11. He came in last year. If you remember that Purdue game, he got into the game, and the first play ever in his college career was a targeting call, which was kind of a garbage call if you ask me. But he was in the game immediately. You started to hear rumblings of him in the offseason, of a guy who was really performing well at camp. And he didn't even come in. Like, some of these guys come in early enrollees in January when they're freshmen, and so they have a longer time to sort of develop into being a contributing player once fall rolls around. I don't think Abdul Carter got to Penn State until June of last year. So he had a very short amount of time to kind of get acclimated to college life, go to fall camp, and then immediately became a contributor on the defensive side of the ball. They saw something in him. They gave him number 11 for a reason, and the guy is an absolute freak. I read something recently that said, this season might be what we all wanted from Micah Parsons, because we got gypped out of that COVID year when Micah Parsons opted out for good reason. I don't blame him because it was such a mess there in the Big Ten that year, but you just wondered what Micah Parsons could have done his junior year. Well, Abdul Carter almost feels like he's a step ahead of Micah Parsons in that way, more of a natural linebacker, so he didn't have to get used to the position almost like Micah Parsons did coming from defensive end. So Abdul Carter, you can't say enough about the guy in terms of his athletic ability and his ability as a linebacker, and he's already shown signs of just being at an elite level. I mean, this is a guy who could be an All-American this year, and that's not hyperbole. That is what other national pundits say. So who else is at the linebacker spot? Oh, well, a guy who decided to come back. Not as big, I would say, as Olu Fashanu, but pretty close to being as big news in the offseason as Olu Fashanu deciding to come back was Curtis Jacobs deciding to come back. Now you've got 2 outside linebackers. Curtis Jacobs was a 5-star recruit out of high school. I mean, this is not some slouch. Now, it took him a little longer to develop, which just underlines how much of a freak Abdul Carter is to come in as a freshman and be a freak. Curtis Jacobs has just been a solid linebacker for Penn State for years. Last year, he stepped up his game even more. He's a selfless player. They wanted to get Abdul Carter on the field, so that meant Curtis Jacobs moved to other positions. Positional flexibility is big for both of those guys. Sometimes Abdul Carter might have to play the Mike position, middle linebacker, instead of being an outside guy. Same thing with Curtis Jacobs. He might have to flip to the other side. So Curtis Jacobs, a selfless player, a leader on this team, a surefire tackler, just another guy who could be an all Big Ten type player. He might not be your LeVar Arrington, but he's going to maybe be your, thinking of another name, your Dan Connor, who's on the staff. So 2 great outside linebackers, no question about it. Middle linebacker has been the question mark. Last year, you saw sort of a rotation between Tyler Elsdon and Kobe King, and you kind of were left wanting a little bit more at that position. And so this year, I guess it was sort of a question mark. You had guys coming back who contributed, had a lot of experience at that position, but no one who really flashed. And when you've got, Curtis Jacobs and Abdul Carter flanking you, making these incredible plays and being the superstars that they are, then you start to look at the middle linebacker spot and say, hey, what if we had one of those guys there? By all accounts, again, this is not my opinion. This is just what's been coming out of camp. Again, James Franklin does not just spout off about any old player and say, this guy's great and this guy's great and this guy's great. He'll shoot you straight for the most part when he's talking to the media. Kobe King, by all accounts, has taken a giant step. This is his 3rd year with the program, and it's kind of funny because Kalen, who is his twin brother, Kalen King, who everybody knows, star corner, comes in and immediately contributes as a freshman. I remember hearing buzz about him as soon as he stepped foot on campus. They're saying, well, this guy's special. And it turned out to be true. Kobe has sort of taken a longer time to get acclimated and get to a point where he can be a big-time contributor. Now, not only is he going to be a contributor, he's going to be a leader on that defense, calling the defensive plays. And you hear interviews with him and you see him on camera. He seems like just a well-put-together guy. Seems like an interesting guy. For a while, he's a pescatarian. I heard an interview recently. Then he started eating meat again. I think he's back off of it now, paying attention to his diet. And also a twin brother of Kalen on the field. How cool is it to have 2 brothers on the field playing at a high level? To see Kobe King take that step this year, it's almost like quarterback, where it's like maybe not as dramatic, but if the middle linebacker spot can play at an extremely high level, you're talking about a linebacker core that is going to be very, very difficult to game plan against with Abdul Carter, Curtis Jacobs, and Kobe King. And then I do want to mention, there's guys behind them. Of course, Tyler Elsdon, I did mention. Dom DeLuca, a former walk-on who's a captain of this team. He'll be in the mix there at linebacker at times. But Tony Rojas, big-time linebacking recruit out of Virginia, big recruiting win there for Penn State, comes into the program as a freshman and immediately turned heads. In the blue-white game in the spring, turned heads. He's going to be a contributor this year in fall camp. He's a guy that's out there being a leader already as a freshman. So the lineage continues in terms of big-time freshmen at Penn State playing the linebacker position. And I do want to mention Tony Rojas, number 13. Look for him to contribute early and often for this Penn State defense. But it really starts with Abdul Carter and Curtis Jacobs being absolute superstars. Looking forward to seeing them, but also looking forward to seeing an elite secondary. Let's talk about those guys. So I started talking about the defense by talking about some statistical categories from last year, and specifically pass breakups. Number 1 in college football last year from this secondary in terms of pass breakups, 99 pass breakups. And, that's the type of thing. Of course, it's not an interception. It's not a turnover, but it's a big deal. The opponent completion percentage was 52% last year, which was good enough for second in the nation for this secondary. That means, 52% completion percentage for a quarterback. That's pretty bad, which is good when you're a Penn State secondary. So a ton of talent coming back again. I mentioned Kalen King. This guy, He's going to be gone after this year, going to the NFL. I mean, he's slightly undersized for a corner. Penn State's been like getting bigger corners, but just an absolute monster in coverage. And when I think about Kalen King, I just start salivating thinking about that matchup between Kalen King and Marvin Harrison Jr. I mean, if they're both going to go to the league, and I just imagine maybe like this is the start of a long story of those guys facing each other. Last year, I think Joey Porter Jr. was matched up against Marvin Harrison Jr., but this year it's going to be Kalen King. And just getting a little ahead of myself, this is why I think Penn State matches up well against Ohio State. I mean, it's your good on good. Kalen King is, arguably one of the best players on the team. Marvin Harrison is not arguably the best player on the Ohio State team. He is. He's the best player on that team, maybe the best college football player in the nation. And we've got a guy that's going to go toe-to-toe with him. Now, wide receivers are going to get the edge most of the time, just because that's the nature of the game. But Kalen King has the speed, and he's just a good football player that's going to be able to make up some mistakes. And he's got guys around them that are going to help him out. All Big Ten type player in Kalen King, and an All-American type player in Kalen King. In fact, he is on a preseason All-American list along with Olu Fashanu, two preseason first-team All-Americans for Big Ten, for Penn State. Kalen King is one of those guys. So he's going to be at the one corner. Joey Porter Jr. playing for the Steelers this year. I look forward to watching him play there. Johnny Dixon is going to be on the other corner. And James Franklin, again, he calls out individuals, and he doesn't do this for everybody. It's starting to sound like it because there's a lot of guys popping in camp, but just from watching James Franklin's press conferences over the year, he's very selective in who he calls out in terms of this guy is a guy to watch. Johnny Dixon, apparently, by James Franklin's words, has had one of the best camps of anyone on the entire team, and they feel really good about him, to the point where, now this is kind of crazy, Penn State goes out in the transfer portal last year to try to add more talent to that corner room. They go down and get, from North Carolina, they get Storm Duck, incredible name. They get Storm Duck out of the transfer portal. Storm Duck comes up to Penn State in the spring. He competes at the corner position. At the end of spring ball, it's announced Storm Duck is now transferring out of Penn State. So he transfers to Penn State for spring ball and then immediately leaves. Reason being, Johnny Dixon is not a joke, and you do not take his position from him. Incredible that a guy who was all ACC, I believe, second team or something like that for North Carolina, comes up, expects to get the starting job at Penn State at the other corner opposite Kalen King, and Johnny Dixon says, no thanks, I am not going to give that position to you. So, I mean, this dude, he's not messing around. Storm Duck then transferred over to Louisville, where he will be a starting corner, presumably. But that just kind of illustrates what we're dealing with on the other corner. And then it goes deeper than that. You've got a lot of young guys that can step in at the corner position. And then Daquan Hardy is a guy who can play corner, but also is going to play in sort of the slot corner position. They'll bring him in on third down packages and things like that. So a lot of talent in the corner room. Terry Smith, as I mentioned, the old head letterman from Penn State, leading that group, and he has just done a phenomenal job recruiting and developing excellent corners. I mean, at this point, again, it's a long lineage of just, I mean, you listen to national pundits and things like that, and they'll say, as expected, Penn State's secondary is going to be solid because in the James Franklin era, at least, it has just consistently been really talent rich. Sometimes there's been a hole here or there where maybe a safety position, there's a guy who's not as good, or maybe one of the corners isn't as good. This year, everybody is just playing at a high level. I'm just going to move right into the safeties from there. You got four safeties that Penn State feels really good about playing right now. And James Franklin kind of looks at it as four starters for two positions. Again, just keep saying that we're at the end of this preview now. There's so much depth. There's four bona fide starters at the safety position for two, starting jobs. You've got Keaton Ellis, who is a State College native, who they feel really good about. He's a team captain, went out to Big Ten Media Days to represent Penn State. And the thing about Keaton Ellis that I love is that he's like a lifelong Penn State fan. There is a Halloween photo of him dressed up for Halloween in a Penn State uniform wearing number 2, which now he's on the field in a Penn State uniform wearing number 2. I mean, pretty incredible story for Keaton Ellis to kind of see dreams become a reality. Then you got Jalen Reed, who performed at a really high level last year for Penn State. But the guy everybody's really talking about is Kevin Winston, who last year came in as a young player, I believe a freshman, and now looks to take over that role of like a Tig Brown type. And it seems like he might take the starting job from Keaton Ellis. But again, it's 4 starters at that position, 3 or 4 starters at that position who are going to really vie for playing time. Talent rich all over the secondary. But Penn State is, looks to build off of that 99 pass breakups. It's going to be, I mean, think about this defense as a whole. You got pass rushers up front. You've got an elite corner on one side and a very talented corner on the other. You've got really good safeties. I forgot to mention freshman King Mack, who everybody's been talking about as a sort of undersized 5'9", which is my height, believe it or not. But I'm not going to be hitting like King Mack, who is a freshman. Another incredible name, someone to look out for. King Mack going to be a safety as well. He's going to be part of that conversation. So you've got hard-hitting safeties up top. You got elite corners, at least one on one side. We're going to see how elite Johnny Dixon is. James Franklin seems to speak highly of him. You've got incredible pass rushers at the DN spot, and then you've got all-timers at the Penn State linebacker spot. So there are not many weaknesses on this defense. It's going to be a defense that you want to see come onto the field. You know, it feels like a lot of years you kind of want to see the offense more than you want to see the defense. I think this year, even though the offense is going to be fun to watch, we're going to have a lot of fun watching Manny Diaz's defense this year just fly around the field with the athletes they have. Are you really still watching this? It's been going on for a while, but hey, listen, you needed to know about Penn State. I just crammed 8 months into a relatively short amount of time, if you think about it, and I hope you learned something about this team more than you did know last year. All you really need to know is that Penn State could win a national championship this year. I just went down the list and told you why. They are talent rich at every position. They've got depth, superstars, and they've got a schedule, again, that I think lines up well for them. You start off against West Virginia. That is going to be absolutely bonkers in Beaver Stadium. You're talking about a team with all this hype in the world. It kind of reminds me of 1999 when Penn State was highly ranked in the AP poll and Arizona was coming into town for this big national matchup. Game day, I think, was there. And LeVar Arrington was on the cover of Sports Illustrated in the preseason. And Penn State just went out and stomped them. I hope that's what happens against a West Virginia team that I think is pretty outmatched by a very talented Penn State team. And then beyond that, in the early part of the season, you're going to have a really big test against Illinois on the road. It's going to be a noon game, which really is like 11 a.m. So that's going to be difficult. Illinois had a very strong defense last year, though a lot of pieces from that defense have left. They've got some guys who are going to fill in there and probably be a bit of a challenge for Penn State. I still think Penn State outmatches them and will win that game, but it's going to be a challenge, especially for first-year starter Drew Aller. Then the whiteout against Iowa. Iowa has sort of become a rival to Penn State over the years just because of, you don't really like their coach. You don't really like kind of how they do their business. Last time we were in Iowa, they claimed that Penn State players were faking injuries. Meanwhile, P.J. Mustipher was out for the season that year after that injury. That's when they were really booing him to get up off the field. So there's some history there. There's some bad blood. And now Iowa comes to Penn State, and that bad blood is in the minds of these Penn State fans. It's going to be a ruthless environment in that whiteout for Iowa. And I think everything lines up to Penn State's favor. However, it's Iowa. And Iowa is Iowa. And if you need any more explanation than that, you haven't been watching Penn State play Iowa over the years. Iowa is Iowa, and that's all I'll say about that. I still think Penn State gets out of there unscathed. So where are the hiccups on the schedule? Oh, I think you might have guessed. Yes, they go to Columbus to face the Buckeyes this year, and yes, they play Michigan. They're also on the schedule coming to Happy Valley. Can they win those games? Well, I mentioned it a little bit, but I think Penn State matches up really well against Ohio State. This is kind of what James Franklin has been recruiting for: speed, athleticism, depth everywhere, defensive ends who can get after the passer. It really sounds like, besides the wide receiver position, where I think Ohio State is just on a different stratosphere, Penn State matches up really well with them roster to roster on paper. Now, Ohio State, of course, recruits at an insanely high level, and they probably have more highly touted players on their team. But in general, I think Penn State matches up really well with Ohio State's game plan. I mean, they proved that time and time again. If Penn State's going to beat Ohio State, they're going to have to do it on the road in a tough environment. But all the words coming out of Ohio State's camp from media pundits is that the offensive line is a big question mark for Ohio State. The quarterback position is a legitimate question mark for them. Now, they've got two highly touted guys, but neither one has really taken the reins and taking over. And I think at this point, you want one of the guy, if you're an Ohio State fan, you want a guy to take over. Now, we'll see by the time Penn State plays them who's going to be the starter at quarterback. But a shaky offensive line, specifically at left tackle. I talked about Olu and having him there at left tackle. I mean, this underlines the importance of having a big-time left tackle. Ohio State didn't really have one. They had to go to the transfer portal and get a guy out of San Diego State who comes in and is immediately the starter. If you're Ohio State and you're going to the portal to get a starter on the offensive line and that person's immediately starting, I don't think it's a great sign, only because you're Ohio State. You should have guys that are going to be able to play that position at a higher level than someone who entered the portal. I don't know. That's just me, but I think there are question marks along that offensive line for Ohio State, and I don't think there's many question marks in terms of defensive end position at Penn State. So if everybody's healthy and plays ball, you're going to maybe look at a flip of the script from last year when J2 Tuimola, however you pronounce his name, took over the game at defensive end last year and just mauled Bryce Deffner late in that fourth quarter. Maybe we see a flip of the script and we see Chop Robinson, Denai Dennis Sutton, and Adisa Isaac just go after those tackles all game, and we see a different outcome. I think Penn State can win it. I really do. Michigan, I mean, I cannot stand Michigan right now because they are at the top of the Big Ten. They deserve to talk the talk. They have walked the walk. They've been to the college football playoff. They've won the Big Ten championship twice in a row. They're at the top of the game right now. They're at the top of the league. So it's going to take a lot to knock them off. If we were playing in Ann Arbor, I would say that's going to be a tough ask for this Penn State team, even as talented as they are, to go up against a really talented Michigan team. I said they matched up. Penn State matches up well against Ohio State. They don't match up as well against Michigan because Michigan is built differently. Jim Harbaugh spent years building a roster to play old school football of just running it down your throat. And so Penn State last year kind of got out of their assignments on defense. They've had a whole year to really watch the film of last year's game and get that, and really, let that game marinate for a while and see what things went wrong. And you can blame one position group, but really it was the whole defense. Michigan runs this weird offense where everyone kind of, like on a running play, everybody's running towards the sideline, and you got to find the gaps in between the offensive linemen, running back, or tight ends who are blocking for that running back. And if you are out of your assigned gap as a defender, they're going to run past you. If you watch the film from last year, they make Penn State look silly. So it's going to be a tall order. It's in Happy Valley. If Penn State slips up this year, that's going to be the game, in my opinion. But I'm leading you to my prediction of this season, which has to end the preview because it always has. Last year, I made a prediction. I'll say 10-2 if I'm forced to give a prediction. I'm just saying. I said 10-2. We were 10-2. Now, I thought we would beat Michigan last year. I didn't think they would do it again, but I did predict 10-2. First, I'm going to tell you about the floor for this team. I think the floor for this team is probably 9-3. That's the floor. That means they lose to Michigan, they lose to Ohio State, and they lose to another random team. Maybe Iowa, maybe Illinois, maybe someone random. But that's the floor. And that has to be if Drew Aller is just not who we think he is, and if we have some major injuries down the line at several positions. That's where I see the floor. The ceiling is 15-0 in a national championship, and I've never been more confident in saying that ceiling. 15-0 and a national championship. How will they end the regular season? I'm jumping on the train with everybody else and saying 11-1. It is very difficult to go undefeated in the Big Ten, and it's very hard to predict that. So I'm going to say 11-1 for this Penn State team just because you got to leave a little room for a loss. I mean, it happens. Even on your best days, sometimes you're going to lose. So 11-1 is my prediction for this season, and I hope it's enough to get into the Big Ten championship game, and if not, sneak into the college football playoff and win a national title. And listen, they could go 12-0. They could. Absolutely. I think the worst they could do is 9-3. That's my prediction. And this is not a joke, and I'll knock on wood, but I have an Airbnb booked in Indianapolis just because I want to make sure I'm prepared. Listen, if they don't go to Indianapolis, fine. But look, I got our hotel room there. That's how highly I'm putting my money where my mouth is for this Penn State team. I have high hopes for them. You should have high hopes for them. And listen, this is the time of the year where you say, look, I'm ready to get hurt. I'm ready to get hurt. I'm going all in on this team, and if they break my heart, they break my heart. But if you're a real fan, that's what you need to be saying. I'm ready to be hurt. I'm ready to be hurt. I'm also ready to cheer on a Nittany Lions team that I think is one of the best we've seen in a very long time and in the top tier of teams all time in the past maybe 30 or 40 years on paper. It's an extremely fun team. It's going to be a fun team to watch this season. Thank you for watching this preview. And thank you for justifying my obsession with Penn State football and watching all these things and reading all these articles and keeping up with the team all year long so that every August I can come around and speak to you and give you the season preview. That's it. Go State. We are.